that we are very engaged in the discussion. We think this topic is a super important topic for us all to be discussing, and mainly for all of us to be discussing together. So this is our first opportunity to be together in this, and I hope that we remain together for the time to come under those very important topics. So with that, thank you, Sheila, for agreeing to come and to host this event for us. Thanks.
Thank you, Kayla and Luz and Luis for organizing this event. I'm Sheila Velez Martinez. I am the Jack and Lovell Allender Chair Professor of Immigration, Refugee, and Asylum Law at the University of Pittsburgh School of Law, where I'm the Director of the Immigration Law Clinic and the Director of the Center for Civil Rights and Racial Justice. And we are here today as part of a series of events that will take place for the next 4 years, I'm pretty sure, because we are at a critical moment for immigrants and immigration policy in the United States and globally. And what we are experiencing in the United States regarding what's to come after the election of President Donald Trump is not only, and it's not foreign to the United States, and it's not only happening here. And we have a series of panelists that will engage with us, and we're going to talk a little bit about what are the legal perspectives and the framework for what it's now and what it's to come, but also we'll have a conversation about how does the US experience mirrors other experiences and what are the global ramifications. And for that, we have with us today Professor Michael Goodhart, who is Professor of Political Science and Gender, Sexuality, and Women's Studies at the University of Pittsburgh School of Law. He has been the director of the Center for the Global Studies Center and the university. He has a host of publications that are too long. It will take us the whole hour if we say all that Michael has written about, but also he has been a consistent ally, and he's an academic, but also an academic in solidarity, and he uses his scholarship to improve and center the lived experiences of communities in the United States and abroad. So we are very lucky to have Michael here with us today. We are also going to talk about how does this impact the Pittsburgh region? What are the regional and local ramifications of the changes that we expect? And for that, we have Nathan Harper. He is he's the manager of the Office of Immigrants and Refugees Affairs Manager at the City of Pittsburgh. He's been in Pittsburgh since 2022 in this role, but he is a Pittsburgh native. So he is coming back home after 17 years of work with refugee crisis in the Middle East, Yemen, Syria, just to give two examples. And he has brought this expertise to Pittsburgh, and he'll talk to us a little bit about what does this mean for the city and for the region. And we also have Rosa Maria Cristello, and Rosa Maria Cristello is one of my partners in crime for many years. She's the director of the Latino Community Center in Pittsburgh, PA. She is a Pitt graduate. She has an LLM from GSPIA. She is also an Obama leader, one of you in the United States, and has many years of experience working with the community in Pittsburgh. So she's going to give us a perspective of how are people reacting, what are people feeling, how are community-based organizations facing this challenge, and also, and very importantly, and I think that's how we expect to close the event today, it's how can we engage? What is the role that each and one of us can play in expressing our solidarity with these communities? So this is what we're here. We're here because we are expecting dramatic changes to immigration law and policy in the United States in the next 4 years or more. And how do we know that? We know this because we already experienced an onslaught on immigration law and policy 4 years ago, 8 years ago. And this time around, it's interesting to me because it seems that the incoming administration is more prepared to, and they have learned from the mistakes of the past, which will allow them to make changes that are quicker, but also the landscape of the judicial branch has changed. And we have a different Supreme Court that we had years ago. We also have a different judiciary, both in the circuit courts and in the district court. So we expect that some of these changes that were not able to take effect quickly because they were derailed by litigation. I think that litigation this time around is going to be more like speed bumps instead of roadblocks. So if we could use that analogy. What are we expecting from the legal landscape? We are expecting sweeping regulatory changes. Not everything can be changed quickly. So the immigration law has not had a comprehensive immigration reform since 1965. It has had a patchwork of changes, and it's not that easy to change the law. You need both chambers, which they have right now, but they still have substantial internal divisions. So changes that require a regulatory, legal changes to the statute might be slower to come by, but immigration law is so much about regulation, discretion, interpretation, and adjudication, and those things are very quickly to change. But the first thing that we're going to see is bans on nationality and entering the United States. The President of the United States and the Supreme Court said so in the last iteration of the Muslim ban cases, that the President of the United States has a wide authority in determining who can enter the United States. So we'll see immediately changes to who can be admitted to the United States and how people can be admitted to the United States. We'll see immediately restrictions at the border and asylum restrictions, making more difficult for people that are applying for asylum or that are trying to apply for asylum and enter the United States to do so, that it's rather easy to do for the president. We'll see that the discretion and enforcement priorities are going to change. That means that right now we are operating under a system where people that have criminal background, that have issues regarding national security are the priority for removal. And that had allowed that families, for example, binational families, people that had children that are US citizens or spouses that are US citizens, family members or people that were working in the United States but had no criminal contact were not a priority for removal. Now everyone is the same priority. And that is a sweeping change. We are going to see much more detention as a tool. We already know that there are more detention facilities being created and contracts for private detention facilities. That it's going to change. There's a law that was approved in the House 2 days ago that would make mandatory the detention of foreign nationals that are arrested of certain crimes, including shoplifting. But it also gives a private right of action, and it gives a right of action to the state to compel the federal government, the federal agencies to, in effect, detain those people just because they have been arrested. But that is a sweeping change in humanitarian protections. Temporary protected status, humanitarian parole, the special programs that have been created throughout the Biden administration, that is going to change. But what is also going to change is the adjudication of people that are going through the legal process, and we saw that. We're going to see that it's going to be even more difficult to get a visa. It's going to be even more difficult to bring your family members. naturalizations also are going to suffer. During the 4 years of the Biden administration, more than 3 million people were naturalized. It's the largest number of people that have been naturalized under one single presidency. And that is going to change. It's going to affect the path to legal permanent residency and to citizenship for thousands of people that are legally in the United States and that are trying to bring their family legally in the United States. And employment visas are also going to change. If you have been following the conversation on X between the tech right and the nationalist right, there's no meeting of the minds there, but part of the project is also to curtail visas for STEM and foreign nationals and international students. We saw that during the first administration. In fact, the University of Pittsburgh was part of a group of universities that participated in trying to bring some sense into the importance that international students and international scholars have, but those are going also to be targeted. So it's not only communities, and it's not only the mass deportations that they have said that are going to happen, and we're going to talk a little bit about that. This is a wide-ranging, comprehensive onslaught on immigrants and refugees, from legal migration to undocumented migration. So that is why we're here today. And that is part of the conversations that we want to have with Nathan, Rosa Maria, and Michael. And I want to start with Michael and to give us just a bird's eye view from the global perspectives, where this policy sits and this, where are we?
Thanks, Kayla. I have the rest of the 2 hours.
Yes, of course.
I guess I just want to say two things which I think have a chance to elaborate on further as the conversation evolves. But the first is that I think it's really important to situate the changes that Sheila just outlined for us, not just in the context of a broader political change in this country, but as part of a broader sort of trend towards ethno-nationalist exclusionary politics globally. Right? We tend to think a lot, especially in this country, that what's happening here is either the central thing or the thing that's driving things that are happening elsewhere. And while that's sometimes the case, I think it's really important to understand that we're operating in a global political climate where issues around migration and the increased militarization of borders are commonplace in many different places. This is tied, I think, to a very complex set of issues resulting from 50 plus years of neoliberal economic policy, and from heightening climate catastrophe, and from a range of interconnected issues, which, in the space of a short response, I can't really articulate, but which I think it's important to flag now so that we can come back to them later in more specific ways. It's not just the United States that is going to be implementing this kind of exclusive and repressive migration policy in the coming years. That kind of policy is going to become increasingly widespread. And so as movement gets harder, and as the global processes that are driving movement, things like climate change, things like economic deprivation, the upward redistribution of wealth that creates insecure living conditions for people all over the world. As those kinds of processes intensify, the demand for movement, if you want to think of it that way, is going to go up. And so if there's an increased demand for movement and a sort of, I'm talking like an economist, which I never do, and a restricted supply of people willing to accept migrants, then you're going to see more conflict. And you're going to see that conflict not just at the US border, and not just at borders, but across the political landscape. So it's really important to keep that in mind. And so in this way, migration and the issues that we'll be discussing more specifically tonight can't be understood fully in isolation from a whole bunch of other political processes that are going to be happening that have to do with taxation, that have to do with corporate power, so on and so forth. The corporate power piece is the segue to the second opening point that I wanted to make, and then I'll let others speak. But I think it's really important to understand, we hear a lot of rhetoric, especially from Trump and from the right wing, whether in this country or elsewhere, about migration crises at the border is broken, et cetera, et cetera. I think it's really important to understand that the border works precisely the way the current capitalist configuration wants it and needs it to work, which is that it creates a class of insecure, unprotected workers whose labor can be easily exploited for profit. That's what borders do. They're not in some sense natural or God-given, or like borders are created by humans, by societies to do things. And they can be used to do different kinds of things. And one of the things that they're presently used to do, especially in the context of the US southern border, is to help to create a class of, again, insecure, easily exploitable workers. So we'll get into the question of the deportations and how bad we think they're going to be and sort of all of that. But I just want to sort of flag this issue that it's not as if something is broke from a normative point of view, from an ethics point of view. We might think that it's terrible, but it's not as if it's broken in the sense that it's working in some way other than it's intended to do. And so understanding that intentionality behind these kinds of policies is really important. It's not an accident. It's not a plague being visited upon us from some unknown place. It's part of a broader set of policies that are designed to do certain work. So, I mean, I have a lot more to say about all these things, but I think it'll make more sense to do it in the context of specific conversations. But I wanted to sort of flag those two items to start.
But Nick and we know that you have global experiences, but now you bring that to the regional and to the city perspective. So how can you share with us what are your perspectives about impacts in general and from the region?
I think from a regional perspective, okay. I think what you said is sort of kind of reminds me of the many different people I've met over the years in the Middle East that have been impacted by war, by human-caused disasters, natural disasters, climate change, things like that, economic poverty, and how difficult it is for them to move. I spent 3 years in Yemen, and I've been to Palestine a few times. I've been in formerly controlled areas of Syria, controlled by ISIS, and I can tell you that if you're a farmer and from that area in Syria, if you are a street sweeper from who are the poorest of the poor in Houthi-controlled Yemen, if you're a teenager in Gaza, your prospects for movement are none, nearly none. And if you're desperate enough, you will find ways to move. And most of my friendships and the experiences with young people in that part of the world have been them trying to figure out ways to get out and get over to a Western country or to a better opportunities of some sort. And sometimes the West is kind of seen to be sort of the best place to land, but folks will go wherever they can. And I think from a local perspective, a certain percentage of the immigrant population here in Western Pennsylvania is undocumented, and they've arrived from many different routes and angles and reasons and purposes and places. And we as a city have no jurisdiction or no control over their status with as their immigration status. And we fortunately previous mayoral administration saw fit to invest resources, human resources, financial resources into establishing my office and to start thinking very systematically about how can we better integrate the immigrant population, regardless of their status, into the life of this city, because they have single-handedly reversed the demographic trends of this region and saved it from absolute economic collapse. But yet, even so, we are a diverse region as it relates to worldviews and values and moral positions. And so social cohesion can be very challenging, and the manifestation of the national narratives around immigration do manifest at this level. So we are thinking from our perspective of how do we do this well? How do we do immigrant inclusion well? How do we and my perspective coming into this job, which I'm actually not since 2022, it's 4 months. And so, but my perspective is I'm very much enjoying this shift in my career, because over the last 10 years, it's been utterly frustrating to see how countries like Jordan, where you have 1 in every 8 people who is a Syrian or Yemeni refugee or Iraqi refugee, and over half the population comes from another country, from a conflict. There's not a public will to sort of give people rights, and to give them legal status, and to give a long-term, what we call a durable solution for their livelihoods. And the same could be said about just how the other wars have impacted people that were displaced by them in the region. Whereas here you have a city and many service organizations within it, and community organizations within it, like Rosa Maria is here, that are just eager to welcome them, eager to support people during that transition, as they arrive, as they figure out their lives here, how to find housing, how to build a livelihood, how to get their kids in school, things like that. We in Pittsburgh, we want to be, as a matter of policy, a welcoming city, and we want to do it very well. So there is though we are in a restricted and a dark world, in some senses, you have these, I think, bright spots in many different cities throughout the United States.
Thank you. Professor Maria, give us your, where you are community-wise, where's the community, how's the community looking at this?
Yeah. So I'm coming from the perspective of working directly with families and children. So we work with over close to 2,000 families a year at the center, and our focus is really on education and family support. It's always been that. And so this time around, there's obviously a lot of fear. We're already seeing a lot of our families that we've known leave. They themselves have left. And so that's just heartbreaking, I think, for many of us who know these families. And it's a shame for the city, for our country, really, that we're losing families. So as an organization, we're looking from the beginning, I divided it into 3 different buckets so that I can kind of understand and have a plan. And so I divided it into how do we protect our families and our people? How do we prepare our staff? And how do we prepare our physical center, right? And so that's how I'm thinking about it as an organization. because there's a lot of questions and there's a lot of unknowns. What we do know is that, as Shayla mentioned, they're going to be much more prepared this time around, and the impact is going to be harder. What we're looking at is several years of just it's going to be sad, it's going to be hard, and so that's why we have these three focuses: is how do we prepare ourselves. So in the context of our physical building, it's looking at heightened security, right? It's looking at taking down any type of signage because we are a target, right? It's looking at making sure that we are trained in how to interact with ICE if they were to come to the center. It's looking at how are we keeping our data records, and what do we have and what do we not have. And I can tell you that you cannot go into the center and there's no list at the center that you can get of our families and their status. That's always been the case. It's definitely the case right now. Like, we don't keep that information, we don't ask. And this is because not that long ago in Texas, the Attorney General of Texas actually went after a nonprofit in Texas to ask for their records, right? And so it's not far-fetched that this could happen. And so we don't keep any of that. We are preparing our staff. We're thinking a lot about the mental health of our team and the burnout that can happen, and the second-degree trauma that can happen, right? That will happen. So we're thinking through with partners on how to address that. And then on the family side of things, we are focused again on family and children. And so we're really focused on family preparedness. And what does that mean? That means having very, very difficult conversations with every single family member, every family that we work with, and helping them jot down and put on paper, what is the plan if you are to be deported? What is the plan for your children? Who do you want them to stay with? We need you to write down their allergies, their favorite toys, right? Their favorite characters, any medical situation, anything like that, right? Because that is the reality of what we're facing, and part of my job right now is working a lot with the school districts and helping them understand you will be having children already going to school and terrified that they may not see their parents when they get back. That is the reality. And so we're planning on all fronts, right? But those are the difficult conversations that we're having right now. We're working closely with Shayla and the Pitt family law that has helped us develop these documents and help us translate documents that specifically describe what is custody, because it's different in every state. And so understanding that, these are very serious conversations we're having with parents. And so they need to understand too what it is that they're doing, right? And so right now it's working a lot with partners. That is something I've seen different this time around in 2016. There is a large spirit of collaboration this time around from immigrant serving organizations. We want to work together. There's we just should not be working alone this time around, absolutely not. We're stronger in numbers and we each have our different strength. And so those are conversations that are also happening at the local level. Yeah.
So let's continue talking about deportations and how extensive we think deportations are going to be. Certainly the mass deportation, it was one of the central slogans of the campaign, and tied mass deportations to the border crisis, which is completely misleading. Because most of the people, and I think that this doesn't get explained enough, but there are hundreds of thousands of people that have entered the United States through the border during the last 4 years. That is absolutely true. Most of the people that have entered, and especially those that have entered during the last years with the special app and the special procedure at the border, are physically present in the United States, but they're all in deportation proceedings. They're not physically present, working and living in the United States unknown to the government. They are all in removal proceedings. There are proceedings before the immigration court where they will have to attend. They have to present their defenses, and if they lose their cases, they will be removed to their home country. So it's misleading to say that this is sort of a free-for-all invasion, because all these cases are cases that are before the immigration courts, that the immigration courts are insufficient, that the procedures are slow, and they don't serve well their purpose. That is another conversation. But it is not that people are just freely invading. And actually, most people use the app. There's more people entering through the CBP1 app than just crossing the border. And even the people that are crossing the border, they're turning their sims in because they want to go through the process, right? So there's really, like Michael would say, there is a border. There are policies that are working as they are intended to work. And the first people that are at real risk of deportation are those people that are in proceedings, and those people that already have orders of removal, orders of deportation, and either remain in the United States or have been granted a reprieve from removal because of prosecutorial discretion, because they were removable, but they had 3 US citizen children, that they had parents with special needs. Those people that are already on the radar and on the system of immigration are at a higher risk of removal, and that those are the in Puerto Rico we say they are el mango bajito, so it's that they're easier to grab. The same, it's true for people that enter into contact with local law enforcement. So people that are arrested by federal authorities, certainly, but also those that come into contact with local law enforcement agency. And here we will have to be watching closely our cities and counties and states and how they collaborate in the removal of people. From your perspective, Michael, Rosa Maria, and Nathan, what are your take and how widespread this could be, but also what are the impacts for the economy? You mentioned, Nathan, initially that immigrant settlement in the region of Pittsburgh have been incredibly important to reverse the population loss that had been plaguing the region, and has been key for economic development. So what are the impacts of removal or these deportations?
Yeah, I think, well, before I respond, I just want to say I'm really impressed by the fact that it is 6:40 on Friday evening and there's not a chair in sight and it's empty. I'm not sure if it's us or the empanadas, but they were good. Whoever decided to bring them, thank you. No, the extent of the sort of the what it would look like to remove 13 to 15 million undocumented or out of status immigrants in the United States is estimated to cost somewhere between 160 to 320 billion dollars over 10 years or so, and but that's not even the biggest cost. It's the economic impact of that, particularly long term. And I was sitting with an economist today at Duquesne University, and I thought she kind of framed sort of this dynamic locally very, very well, in that there's a, particularly with the undocumented workforce here in the region, there's a very complementary interdependence between everybody else in the workforce and that particular group. And it's a little bit, I reckon that once we start talking about economics, there's I often find that often there can be a sort of a tension in the room, because I think most of us here, if I'm reading the room right, you're more interested in the human rights perspective, the humanity of this this situation. But the reality in November is that America once again put Donald Trump in office largely around the economy. And it's hard to understand why people trust his vision for this more than others, but we are in this place. And I think in many ways the economy and what's going to happen as a result of deportations is probably the language and the narrative that we need to be leaning into in order to come up with practical policy solutions for the long term. As you were saying, the immigrant system in America is broken. It's been broken a long time, and it's just getting more dysfunctional over time. But the reason why people keep coming to America is very much because there's a need for, as Michael was saying, there's a need for labor. There's a need for people. There's a mutual. If I can find a way to escape poverty, a way to have a better future, if I can find a way to escape persecution or discrimination, or from having to be conscripted in a war, I'm going to do whatever I can to do that. And when people get here, there's just it's not that difficult to find ways to make money, and particularly with how resourceful people need to be in a very limited resource context, such as the Middle East. You know, the work ethic translates in ways that are often very advantageous for people over here. I mean, I wrote up a ton of statistics here and information around sort of the economy and sort of how that's going to be impacted. But I just maybe I'll just end with sort of the reality around a policy of mass deportation in the long term is that it would, over 10 years, it would reduce the nation's GDP by up to 2.6%. And we would lose 4.7 trillion over 10 years. It would, the hardest hit industries, that the industries that would be hardest hit would be as a result of reductions in workforces, and that would be agricultural, construction, leisure, and hospitality. Particularly in Pennsylvania, in this region here, construction, agriculture, and professional cleaning, 20 to 30% of our labor workforce is from undocumented, unauthorized workers there. But the largest declines in the GDP nationally would occur in the largest industries that do not have an immigrant workforce heavy, immigrant heavy workforce, and that would be in finance, manufacturing, wholesale, retail, trade. And then the states in the United States that have some of the highest GDPs would be hit the most, such as California, Texas, New York, and New Jersey. So it's we're looking at an economic depression that has, what the person I spoke to today was saying would be that we haven't had one like this since the 1930s. So, and it was a similar protectionist policies and things like that that led to that. So I'll pass it on.
Thank you, Nathan. And Michael, so if we're talking about massive removal, what are the ramifications that has, not only on the recipient countries and their economies, but looking at it within the context of global migratory movements?
Yeah, I want to say something about that, but first I want to, if I could, add on to something that Nathan said, because I think it's important, because I think actually that the economic sort of analysis that you outlined is consistent with what I've seen elsewhere, and so I agree with that, and it's precisely because of that that I'm skeptical that there's actually going to be a program of mass deportation. Now, that's not necessarily good news and on a couple of fronts, and I just want to explain why. I think the reason it's unlikely that we'll see mass deportation is the economic rationale that Nathan just outlined. Jim, you, I think at the beginning referred to like divisions within the incoming administration. You mentioned the sort of tech bro camp of the Trump coalition. You know, there's also a Wall Street branch of that coalition. And then there's a kind of Christian nationalist, for lack of a better term, branch of that coalition.
And you can add the U.S. Chamber of Commerce that is a proponent of immigration reform and opposes.
Right, with that, like part of that what I would think of as that Wall Street, right? So these groups all have differing desires and agendas with respect to immigration. So that's, but there's a strong group of folks who understand the economic analysis that Nathan just laid out. But Trump is beholden first and foremost to the folks who voted him. And he's made big promises. So what does this mean? Well, and I can't take credit for this phrase, but Kianga Yamada Taylor at Yale University, someone whose work I follow both as an activist and a scholar, has used the phrase sadistic border theater. Sadistic border theater. We're going to see a lot of performative stuff, dramatic raids, people in large detention facilities, stadiums or the equivalent, you know, back to policies like caging. And I think, like, interestingly, not trying to hide that or shield it from attention, but putting it prominently out there so that it's visible to the constituencies that Trump needs to satisfy.
Sadistic propaganda.
Sadistic propaganda, right, for the purposes of making it seem as though he were following through on the promise of mass deportation. But whether he actually follows through on the promise of mass deportation is a separate question. I tend to think there will be deportations for sure, but there have always been deportations, including more under Obama than under the first Trump administration. So we have to keep that in perspective as well. But I'm a little bit skeptical about the size. That being said, however, in many ways, what I anticipate coming, and I take no pleasure in saying this, will be more terrifying for many people than a sort of orderly, legally roundup of unauthorized people who might be deported in some sort of what you might call, for lack of a better term, you know, law and order kind of fashion. Because the entire point of it is the performative part. And so it's going to be raids on workplaces. It's going to be, you know, snatching people out of schools. It's going to be, again, this kind of border theater of cages and military patrols and all that. It's going to be horrific. And that does two things, right? It satisfies this constituency that Trump needs to satisfy, but then also makes further insecure and even more easily exploitable this class of minoritized people who can then be squeezed even harder for profit, who can be taken further advantage of because of their unauthorized status, who can be, will be even more fearful about reporting the kinds of abuse, whether that's employer abuse, wage theft, inhumane working conditions in the workplace, all the way to things like domestic violence or child abuse in the home because of the fear of deportation of a family member who, despite their abusive behavior, maybe no one in the family wants or can afford to see, arrested, deported, whatever it might be. So when I say that I don't think there are going to be mass deportations, that doesn't mean I don't think it's going to be horrific. But I think that there's reason to believe that the numbers won't potentially be as high as we're being led to believe. And again, think also of the exhaustion that can be inflicted on organizations like yours and the ones that we work with, Holly, and others, who are going to be on constant alert, expending tons of resources to get into this really important, central defensive posture, the sort of mental exhaustion, the burnout, like all of that is, again, not unintentional, right? It's part of a plan to exhaust, demoralize, deplete, and ultimately defeat any kind of, characterize them how you want, progressive, social justice oriented, community solidaristic, whatever organization. So that's, I wanted to say that, piggybacking on what Nathan said. In terms of global trends and patterns, again, we can think a little bit of migration policy, really a whole set of interrelated policies, right? As a kind of something that can be turned up and down or focused to different places at different times and in different ways. We've already seen Trump making noise about the northern border, which is not something we tend to hear much about in the US, but using that as rhetoric and leverage to try to gain certain kinds of advantages on trade and technology and frankly, fossil fuel and mineral extraction rights and concessions vis-a-vis Canada, which is in a particularly politically weak position now with the resignation long overdue, depending on who you talk to of Justin Trudeau and the political turmoil that's there, but with a likely incoming conservative government in Canada as well. So I think that in terms of these global flows, what I would pay attention to again is the way in which, as right-leaning, call them ethno-nationalists, call them fascistic, call them what you like. We could debate in a separate context the merits of those different labels and what work they do for us and so on. But as there are more of these kinds of governments, which it seems likely for there to be, the German elections coming up, Austria just elected a far-right party. It's hard to see what's going to happen in France. That's going to turn out well in this regard in the next couple of years as they stumble forward. This could have big effects on EU policy, but I anticipate a general tightening of migration policy, of more exclusive borders, more militarization of those borders, and so on. Again, with the understanding this plays out differently in different national economies, which are of course interconnected in complex ways, but always with an eye towards the sort of economic impact. But as that gets tighter, and yet as climate in particular, but also conflict, and those two things are also not unrelated, right? And we have to think about the connections there. But as those things push more people to try to move, what I think we're just likely to see is a lot more conflict at and around borders in general. I don't like, and I'm looking at my friend and colleague Roger Rouse and laughing here. I don't like the language of flows when we think about migration, because people are not water molecules. They don't flow around. They move with intentionality, and people try to direct that movement with intentionality. But I do think that increasing difficulty of movement, as Nathan was describing, doesn't so much discourage people from attempting to move as it does affect their decision making about when, where to try to go, how to try to do it. whether or not to take their families with them initially, all kinds of questions like this that then become part of that equation, right? And so how this plays out, globally, I mean, again, another important thing to keep in mind, we talk about migration, and even the way I'm speaking now, a lot of what I'm describing is a politics of kind of North America and Northwest Europe. Huge amounts of people moving throughout East and Southeast Asia, throughout Africa, as a result of various kinds of conflicts, economic pressures, climate pressures, again. So how all this fits into the global story, I think, is really complex. But I do think that, if I had to sum it up in 2 words, I would think like increased conflict, as in relation to movement, is the thing that I'm most worried about in the coming years.
Two comments regarding the global and one regarding the gestalt that we talked about. I think though how it might not change people's decision to leave, right? But it makes it more perilous. It makes it more dangerous. The risk is greater. I mean, if you haven't been following the experience of migrants through the Darien Stretch, I invite you to follow that, and how now even increased military operations there have taken people to take a sea route, and the thousands of people that have been dying at sea in very difficult, perilous waters. It also places more importance in organized trafficking and coyotes, and makes it more difficult, and the routes that people take are more perilous, including the razor wire in the Rio Grande River. So there is also the increased risk of death and hurt in this process. It also, the last time that the US did something similar to what it's kind of massive removals, in 1996, the immigration law changed considerably to add many more crimes as grounds for deportation, and there was a concerted effort by immigration authorities in the United States to focus on gang activity in the West Coast to apprehend and remove gangs. And those removal of gang members from California and across the West Coast of the United States gave rise to the current issue with gangs in El Salvador, Honduras, and Guatemala. So those gangs that are the Mara Salvatrucha, Barrio 18, those are US gangs. Those were people that were nationals of El Salvador, Guatemala, and Honduras, had never really lived there, became gang members, and transplanted the gang problem to the point that controlled those countries for many years. So there are also other consequences to how the United States deals with migration, and we've had the same experience also, for example, when deportation restarted in Haiti, which is one of the goals of the administration, is to restart deportations to Haiti and also to Venezuela. So I agree with you. I don't think we're going to see 10 million people be deported, but I think it's going to be performative in that sense, that it's going to be more dangerous for community people trying to migrate to the United States, but also targeted and political. So we'll see more targeted removal of people from what the administration has called in the past shithole countries, or countries that there is a political interest. And I wanted to ask Rosa Maria, what are the consequences of this gestalt, this performance of fear, right? And how does that affect the well-being? How does that affect the families, the communities, public health, people going to the school, going to the doctor?
Yeah, I hear all of this, of it not being like, it's not going to be the millions that will be deported. It's going to be, and I understand that. But the best way I can describe it is, it's like a game of Russian roulette. right? Because I get that you don't know if that's gonna be our families. You don't know that. It very well be that our very close, friends could be the ones that are then in the news, that they were the ones that. So, living like that is what we're trying to elevate to in our position, like the schools. You talk about the economic impact. No one's really talked about the economic impact from 10, 20 years from now, and what the effect that's going to be because of what it's currently doing in the stress level of our kids, right? You're talking about a whole group of children that have every single right to grow up to be the best versions of themselves, to be attorneys, to be doctors, to be teachers, to be chefs, to be, and they are not being provided an environment where they can thrive to be that best versions of themselves under this. Just by looking at the pictures and by knowing that, again, this could be me, right? This could be my family that's going to go through this. So I don't know if anyone has done the math on like the economic impact that it's going to have in the future, but we need to look at that, because while they want to remove the birthright citizenship, the fact is that right now, any one of those children that are born here, they are US citizens, and we need to take care of them as such. And so the stress and the anxiety that is being felt is very real. And what I would like to see is more elevation of and more focus on like, what does that stress look like for 0 to 5, like the young children, right? That's something that we're not really talking about. But let me tell you, as someone who grew up in that environment, like being a child in a home environment where you are mixed status, you can cut the tension with a knife, right? And so what is that doing to the brains of the little ones? What is that doing? We don't know that. No one's really talking about that. And I really want to see more of that, because we need to put that in the forefront. So I don't know. I mean, it's a scary time.
So are you concerned about sort of immigration McCarthyism of people calling and
Yes.
the community, it's a community concern, and are you concerned about children being taken out of school, not going to the doctor or to receive social services at partner organizations? So thinking about long-term public health consequences,
Absolutely.
educational consequences.
Yeah, all of it. And so an example is the first time around, they went after public health, public benefits. So SNAP, right? What was it?
Public charge
Rule, yeah. And so what I'm foreseeing is, and we're already seeing, a lot less families are signing up for SNAP benefits, food stamps, right? And so that is nutrition that our children have the right to. If they qualify for that, they should be getting that. But in order to apply to that, families need to submit a whole list of their information, including their status in this document, to the state. And so what are families doing? It is a great unknown. What is the state? How are they actually protecting that information, right? So families need to make these decisions. Do I sign up for food stamps for our kids and risk it or not? And so we saw it then, we're gonna see it now, a lot more in food insecurity, which is like, I know we'll get to this, but paying attention to like the food bank and supporting the food bank in these instances, right? With culturally appropriate foods, that's going to be a need. It's ensuring that kids, we're going to see a dip in kids going to school. We're going to see that, and that's why, again, we're trying to talk to the schools and ensuring that they reach out to families and do everything they can to do that. We're paying attention closely right now to the FAFSA, right? And what does that mean for our children? And we can't confidently tell our families, fill out the FAFSA, go through the process right now, because no, it is very unclear how safe that data is. So what does that mean? That means a lot less of our kids who have these dreams of going to college are gonna have to opt to not go, or, and we have this, we see this, families going into deep debt to pay off so that their kids can go to college, right? So all of these have different effects.
So next, I'm gonna put you in the spot. So how is the city looking at these challenges and looking to support or address or educate, work with the community for that, or to address some of these challenges?
Yeah. The city of Pittsburgh in Allegheny County has got to be the most dysfunctional governmental setup I've ever seen.
And you've been in your.
Yeah. I shouldn't say dysfunctional. It's just strange. I don't understand why we have so many we've just segmented ourselves in so many different ways. But it is what it is. It's an historical reality. There's but the economies of scale and the efficiencies that are possible in places like Philadelphia, where they unified the city and the county. I don't know when, but probably a while ago. It's there. But the ability of the city of Pittsburgh and the mayor's office and city council to affect policy at DHS, at Pittsburgh Public Schools, at the police, the various police precincts in different municipalities in the county, it's just not there. It's segmented. So what we and I think that there's often been, if I've gotten one question more than any since I started, is Pittsburgh a sanctuary city? And it's just very interesting how that term gets thrown around, especially since November 5th. About like, okay, where are the sanctuary cities, things like that, and often we don't know what that means. I'm a anthropologist by the master's in anthropology, and my focus was on tribalism in the Middle East and in Arabia. And there are still villages and towns to this day where somebody who's fleeing sort of retaliation as a result of doing something that would be where it would be socially acceptable to retaliate against that person, they can go to these places and that city will protect them. But in America, we don't have that. And there's no such thing as a real sanctuary city in America, even though San Francisco, Chicago, New York, massive sanctuary city ordinances. But fundamentally what that means is that there are policies in place that are supportive of immigrants and essentially ensures that there's not cooperation, or that the city is not using its own resources to support governmental, federal governmental operations, particularly around ICE. So Pittsburgh doesn't call itself a sanctuary city because it attracts a lot of attention that way. But our policies are in line with sanctuary city policies. And we had a call this week, today's probably 2 days ago. We have a monthly call, a forum that we can convene of different immigrant focused community organizations. We had, I think, something like 65, 70 people on the call. And we focused that entire call and the agenda on sort of mass deportation awareness and preparedness. And the first agenda item was having the chief of police come up and explain to everybody what its non-discrimination policy means. That policy has been in there for years, you know, but it's probably the most important thing right now to be getting out there is helping people be aware and to understand how the city does not ask for people's immigration status. We don't keep that kind of information, and we don't ask for that kind of information. The police do not devote resources towards supporting ICE operations. Neither do they honor the civil warrants or detainer requests from ICE. And there are really important reasons why we don't do that. And that's something that we're really thinking about. How can we more effectively communicate that to our residents, not just our immigrant residents, but also everybody else. And I would just end with this, and that is every city and every town in the United States has to deal with the brokenness of our immigration system in some way, shape, or form. But the reality is that they didn't cause this problem. And to be judged by a certain portion of the political establishment as being sort of complicit complicit with the problems that are plaguing this country per se, by not devoting resources to supporting their operations is just kind of bizarre. And instead, every community, what they do is they address it in ways that are consistent with their values. And there are some communities in Allegheny County and around us that will address this in ways that are consistent with their values. But our values as a city is that every resident, no matter where you're from, you are a resident of Pittsburgh. And that is that's the mayor's position. That is the city's official stance. And we do not discriminate based upon any type of origin. And we want to see solutions. We want to see not just in every aspect of addressing something that's broken in this city or in this country. The mayor really focuses our attention on the root causes. And the root causes are, frankly, centered in the broken policies at the federal level that need to be fixed. And I think that's where we're trying to think about how can we engage with that in effective manners, whilst being a city that is welcoming and supportive of everybody that calls it home.
That comment regarding engagement and support opens the door for me to ask the last question before we open the floor to questions from the audience is, how can people engage with this? How can people support? What can people do? And that's an open question to three of you.
I mean, yeah, I think if I can ask everyone to get trained, attend a Know Your Rights training session, either locally or the ACLU has really good trainings. They just had one last night. They'll have another one January 30th. But Know Your Rights. The National Immigration Law Center as well has a really good training. But why am I asking you to do this is because that's the best way. It's to equip our region. It's to equip every single one of us to understand what can you do, right? If you see an ICE raid, what can you do? If you see one of your neighbors getting detained, what can you do? Back in 2016, it was a lot of white vans that we would see, and that's how we would know that's ICE, right? But there's different things, and what we're hearing is they're gonna be very sneaky, right? They're gonna lie a lot, and so, and so it's important for us to all be trained on how to know who's a police officer, who's a Pittsburgh police officer, and who is ICE, right? It's important for all of us to be trained in this, and while I think I can, rattle a lot of this in my sleep now, I'm not an attorney, and so going to actual trainings with attorneys that can answer your questions and help train you in this, that is the absolute best thing. The second is support the local immigrant serving organizations, either with your time, and that is again going through trainings and understanding what you can do, but also financially. A lot of what we're having to do right now is costing money, and money that we didn't have budgeted, right? And I'm telling you, as someone who's in it, like $5 a month is actually a lot of. So any of that to support the local serving immigrant organizations and get engaged with them and ask them what it is that you need. That's actually one thing that we've been talking about as a collective, is we know there's going to be a lot of people wanting to volunteer, so we're preparing as a collective on how to redirect people, right, as to how to get engaged. Those would be, I think, the main ones. And there's also trainings of how to talk about this. I know the ACLU is actually doing a lot of work on the narrative, right? I think we need to educate ourselves on how to talk about this matter, because I feel like we've lost that battle right now, but it's not the war, right? Like, I think we can get back to this. When we talk about immigration, when we talk about this, we're talking about families. We're talking about like human beings that are doing everything possible to just have a life here. We're talking about families that, like, we have several families that tell us their stories from their home countries and every valid reason to make the journey to come here. That's what we're talking about. The other side is talking about, yeah, criminals and rapists and all that. And I think we're all in agreement that, like, that's bad, right? But they put us all together. And so talking about it and changing the narrative and making sure that we're humanizing this, we need to do a better job at that. And so there are trainings for that. There are resources for that. And I know the ACLU has been talking about like doing a lot of work around that piece.
I'll go.
Yeah.
Yeah.
You want me-
I'll go after you.
Okay. Yeah, I just will add a couple of things that are really just kind of elaborating and amplifying on what you said. You mentioned like support of food banks with culturally appropriate food earlier. I think that's super important. Another thing that's been discussed in some calls that I've been on recently are, making sure that people are prepared and enabled to avoid unnecessary law enforcement contacts. So for instance, if your neighbor's tail light is out, help them fix their tail light so they don't get pulled over by the cops and then find out that, whatever is going to ensue from that is going to ensue, right? It might not be a lot of money, but it might be more money than somebody has. And so there's a whole range of sort of things like that you can think of, right? A lot of this also involves just like getting to know and reaching out to your neighbors and people in your orbit and in your contact, right? And expressing solidarity, right? You've used the term a couple of times, Shelley. I think it's just so important, right? It is much harder for a lot of the bad stuff to go down when a bunch of people show up and are observing, are filming, are paying attention. It can make a big difference. It can make a big difference to just again, these kinds of trainings I think are absolutely essential. I sent the National Immigrant Justice Center has this great checklist, which I sent to Luce, which I think is going to sort of make its way around. One of the things, you mentioned a lot of these already, but like emergency contacts, phone numbers, making sure that the daycare or the school knows who to contact in case something happens to a parent during the day. authorization in writing for people to make medical and legal decisions on behalf of kids. If, you know, in case anything is gonna happen, you know, is another one. There's a whole range of this kind of stuff. Also, you know, we use this terminology and it, you know, again, we have a whole debate about terminology, but you know, we often use the term undocumented to describe people. But in fact, almost everyone has documents that can be really important for them because it makes a big difference. It's my understanding, and Sheila, you'll correct me as an attorney, but how long you've been in the country with respect to the kinds of proceedings that can take place. So if you have documentation of your presence in the country, you know, bills or proof of address or other kinds of things that you have someplace, not only where you know where they are, but that others know where they are and can get those for you, this can make a big difference. So like all of this boils down to this point about education, right? And then that other point about, you know, community and just showing up for each other, I think is going to be massive.
Yeah.
Oh, I'm sorry. Can I add one other thing? I just forgot that. You know, you were describing the city's stance, which I think is great. You know, and I think it can be a real feel-good thing, especially for white liberals, to like demand that their jurisdiction become a sanctuary city, which can often be counterproductive in the ways that you were describing, right? A lot of the way I expect a lot of this stuff to go down is not as much through the like law enforcement side, is through the financial incentives side. A lot of, oh, you want that grant that the Department of Transportation promised you, jurisdiction X. In order to get it, you got to comply with this policy, right? And then this creates a hard situation for a jurisdiction because now money is on the line, right? So a big thing we can do as citizens is be supportive of our elected officials when they do the right thing. Right, and let them know that we support them. You know what? That 40 million for reconstructing whatever, or that new, like that would have been great. But we support you in refusing to turn over, you know, whatever. Like there's, you know, I'm being abstract, but you understand the point, right? And the same thing's going to be true of universities, right? They're not going to shut down programs. They're going to withhold eligibility for Pell Grants or other kinds of things in order to try to force us to do stuff, right? So this is going to be a widespread strategy that's going to be used by the administration because these financial levers, honestly, are a lot easier for them to use and require a lot less capacity on their part. But there are things that we can do to push back against that as well and support our public officials when they do. Sorry, I just wanted to say.
Can I say to that point, pay attention to the bills that are being passed. Bills that have like a story attached that it makes it hard for elected officials to say no to. There's one currently right now. Really pay attention to what it is and what it's actually going to do. And so there's a bill right now that it's what you talked about, Sheila.
Right.
Yep. That would give authority for people that just for shoplifting, they can be detained and they would essentially do away with their due process, right? That can have major ramifications for our community. And there are, you know, we have local elected officials who have signaled that they will be supportive of this. And so if that doesn't sit well with you, just educate yourself about this. We are citizens here and they do need to hear us, right? So pay attention to what's going on.
Yeah, I think just kind of tagging on to Rosa Maria around knowing your rights. Let me ask for a raise of hands here. If you know the difference between an administrative warrant and a criminal warrant.
I learned it today at Casa San Jose. Like, yeah, because I was at a Know Your Rights training.
Yeah, that's right. So that's just a very, very brief example of something that actually really matters. If you go to the PA Attorney General's website and it talks about sort of immigrant rights, The reality is that there are constitutional rights and civil rights that are, and labor rights that are applicable to all immigrants regardless of status. Do we know them? Do we know what people have the right to do if they are encountered by a law enforcement officer or an immigrant agent on the street or in the car?
The most important right is the right to remain silent. Okay? I just can't help myself. This is the most important right that you have as a citizen or as a person facing law enforcement in the United States.
I would just say go home and spend 20 minutes on YouTube just learning about it at a minimum, you know? Or even better, take one of the online trainings that are out there or attend around just the relevant rights that immigrants have here. And I think another really important thing is around sort of this idea of community. And what we can do is just people, average folks, average neighbors, average residents in this town. And that is, there's nothing stopping you from creating a meaningful relationship with your immigrant neighbors. And I guarantee you that those relationships can easily become both mutually beneficial and supportive. I was, lived overseas for many, many years. And as a immigrant in those countries, I flew above a lot of the challenges in those places because I made enough of an income for it to not affect me too much. But that did not impact the loneliness, it did not impact the feeling of separation from me and my family, the cultural shock and the challenges that you have to deal with in a foreign place. And the people that came and just were my friends, or some of them are going to be friends for life. And when we arrived, my wife and I arrived back in Pittsburgh in the summer of 2023, and we took our child to early preschool down Spring Garden, and everybody drops off their kids at the same time, and it's a big hubbub of action and activity, and kids are going crazy everywhere. And we saw this family, this lady with a hijab, a head covering, and a man, and both of them, he had a phone in his hand and he's speaking Turkish into his phone using Google Translate, and we hear them talking in Arabic, and we're like, what's going on? And my wife and I, we speak Arabic, so we talked to them, and we got to realize, well, this family was trying to communicate something about their kid to the people at the school, and we supported a little bit there, but we then started to kind of learn about each other a bit. And this family had been in a refugee camp in Turkey, just a few miles where I was working. And they live just a few streets away from us in Troy Hill. And so it was like perfect. We got the Islamic holidays coming up. We want to celebrate with somebody and have Ramadan, and basically, to make a long story short, our little home in Troy Hill instantly became more colorful and enjoyable for us because we made a friend from that part of the world that we spent so many years. And I could just say story after story, but no matter what happens around us, that things that are out of our control, we have the ability to go out and make connections and support one another. And I would just encourage people to lean into that. And if I can say one more thing, okay, because you guys we're sitting here in a university, and I think if you want to get to the root causes of sort of this reality globally, we've got to look at them intellectually and academically and honestly. And I feel like the hardest countries to get into, if you're an immigrant, are the ones that are most prosperous. Their borders are way more resourced, and they're and it's and I think a lot of it has to do with the fact that it's they have very strong economies, and they have very strong social safety nets. And that seems to be, if I tried to go into a place like Somalia, nobody's gonna care. You know? And this is one of these dichotomies, I think, in the global world that we live in. I think we need solutions. We need to understand sort of how it's not just one academic discipline or another that's going to figure out the solutions to this. But I think we really need to look at this economically, politically, socially, anthropologically, legally, and to work towards a vision of inclusion and freedom that is something that is perhaps maybe beyond our imaginations as we sit here now.
Thank you to all of you. I just want to add that we think about that we also have to challenge ourselves as an idea of what an immigrant is and who might be affected by this. And we usually think about immigration and immigrants, and we think about a Latino man working in the fields or working constructions. But the truth is that Pittsburgh is a very diverse region, and that has growing diversity. In the clinic, we just did this numbers in December. We've represented people from over 100 nationalities, and they're here in Pittsburgh. So it's also for us to be open-minded and to extend our solidarity beyond what might be, expected, or the stereotype of who an immigrant is. Challenge ourselves a little to do that and look at it that way. I'm going to open the floor to questions. So Hank, you have the first question.
Thank you. I fear that my question may result in another, it could be another forum, but I'm eager to hear your answers. With regards to the folks that were convinced to vote for Donald Trump based mostly on their perceived concerns about immigration, how were they so easily convinced? Is it because they themselves were somehow negatively affected by immigration? Is it because immigration and the way it was presented is an easy answer to explain their financial woes? Were they just easily fallen prey to political propaganda? And then how do otherwise good people, or people who think of themselves as good people, allow themselves to be convinced to ignore the humanity in others? How do we engage in counter messaging without simply being labeled as a keyboard commando or a bleeding heart liberal?
You want to start?
I'll start.
I know you.
I have a lot to say on this one, but I'll try and keep it short, which means that it's going to be punchy and provocative and not as well supported as it should be, but I'm happy to back it all up later. I think there's a couple of really important things to understand. One, the economy is a lot worse than Joe Biden and Kamala Harris and economists would have you believe. Economic indicators that have traditionally been used to understand the health of the economy, like GDP growth and inflation rates and unemployment rates, are increasingly, in a highly financialized global economy, disconnected from the material reality that a lot of people experience. That's the first point. The second point is, it was once said in 1920s Germany by a social democrat that anti-Semitism is the socialism of fools. Now, what does that mean? What that means is hating another person and blaming them for your economic woes is a kind of substitute for a genuinely sort of socialistic or left alternative to the capitalist system that is creating the misery that you're experiencing. We don't have a left political party in this country. We have a far-right political party and a moderate to semi-extreme right political party. Those are the two parties that we have in this country. And so you've got that moderate right-wing party going around telling everybody how brilliant the economy is and how happy and grateful they should be for that, and completely ignoring this story of material suffering and the conditions that people are actually experiencing in their lives. And then you've got another guy blaming immigrants for eating pets, which sounds ludicrous and is in fact ludicrous. I mean, the pet in question was featured in an article in like the New York Times the other day, big picture. So the pet is fine. But I'm not trying to make light of something that's very serious, right? That caused a lot of hardship and suffering for a lot of people. But here's the point. One party, the extreme right-wing party, is at least speaking to people's economic fears and insecurities and struggles. And the other party is pretending they don't exist. So if you're given a choice between somebody who acknowledges your reality and provides a bullshit, hateful explanation for it, and a party who doesn't acknowledge it at all, it is not irrational to choose the far right alternative there. And until so-called progressives and so-called leftists in this country realize this fact and start addressing the material insecurity that people are suffering from every day, this is going to get worse, not better. And it's the same story across the OECD countries.
And I'm going to add to that this is a recipe that has worked. So consistently dehumanizing a group of people to use it as a distraction for the incapable state under capitalism. It's proven to be successful. So this let's take the pet eating. That even the defense from Democrats and even the defense from the city of Springfield or whatever was your pets are safe here. The defense was not Haitians are people like us. We don't eat pets. There was zero reference even in the defense of the humanity of Haitians, of how Haitians are like us. Because when you dehumanize a group of people, it's easier to violate their human rights because they're not humans anymore. And so we see this in the Holocaust, we see it in ethnic violence, we saw it in the Rwanda genocide, and that discourse is a discourse on purpose to serve a purpose, to facilitate the policies and have less resistance to that. And we have to be wary of that and challenge that discourse constantly, consistently. This is something that it's on all of us actually to do. More questions, comments? 1 or 2. Yeah.
Okay, thank you. My name is Rachel. I'm writing a dissertation on this topic, so thank you so much for all of your comments. I will be using that for my work. Much appreciated, and just appreciate your work that you're doing on the ground in general. It's really meaningful. My question is for everyone, but it's piggybacking off of something that Nathan had brought up, which is talking about some of these sanctuary declarations or ordinances that have been passed. I learned recently that in the last few weeks, the Wilkinsburg School Board voted to declare itself a sanctuary school, which I was not aware that was something that any organization could take it upon itself to do. So I guess I'm wondering, we know some of the implications of a city declaring itself a sanctuary city, or in Allegheny County's case, declaring itself a sanctuary county. What do you think is the implications of some of these hyper-local responses? Is it more just, this is a beautiful sentiment to reassure the community that we support you? Is it, asking for more trouble? What do you think are some of the responses? And can any organization just do this legally? Like, what's stopping people from following in the lead of that example?
The sanctuary city is not a legal definition. There's not a law that says this is what is sanctuary. It is a sociological term. It's a social movement. It's a political term, and that doesn't mean that it's not important. It might actually make it more important. And it's really difficult for me to judge what communities decide to do regarding things that are really, really important to them, right? So So it would be interesting to listen what was happening, what were the fears, the concerns that Wilkinsburg as a community had to react that way. And I think, and the consequences and the impact that it might have in a school might be different than in a county or in a city with a different visibility. I think that there are many ways of addressing this and being vocal and being visible, and you will have to allow for communities to address it and work towards this solidarity and expressions of community cohesion in different ways. Kind of anything goes. It's how I see it.
Yeah, I would agree, and I said something earlier, and that is that every community, every city needs to is engaging with the brokenness of the system in ways that are consistent with their values. I was in New York City in early December, and I was just absolutely stunned at the resources that state is throwing at the needs of migrants that have made their way to that city. And something like 210,000 people have moved there from the southern border over the last two and a half years. And I think there's somewhere around 6 billion, is that right? 3.3 billion last year alone. It's higher than the entire United Nations global budget, is what they've spent on the housing and basic needs for these 210,000 folks, or I think it was more like 160,000 last year. And this is all as a result of the laws that they've made not just in the city, but at the state legislature, guaranteeing that anybody that needs it can have housing, and just basically social safety nets that are in place, regardless of status. So that is a very extreme level example of how a community will just make decisions based upon their values. And I think what you've said highlights a very interesting example of how a very small entity in the grand scheme of things is doing that. And there's no rights or wrongs there.
We have a question from our internet audience, our Zoom audience, about what are the concerns regarding birthright citizenship? I'm going to take this. I have very little concern about ending birthright citizenship. That is the first sentence of the 14th Amendment. There's enough case law. Wonky Mark, it's probably the first case that the Supreme Court had to deal with this and said, children of immigrants are U.S. citizen at birth as per the 14th Amendment. The case Plyer versus Doe also addressed the rights of children that are people that are undocumented, and children that are not born in the United States, and discusses right. So I don't see, there's only one group of scholars that have mentioned this possibility and a French interpretation of what it means to not be under the jurisdiction of the United States, but there is a wide consensus that the 14th Amendment is very, very clear. Every person born in the United States is a citizen of the United States, and you will need a constitutional amendment to do that. And the 14th Amendment is one of the most beautiful parts of US law. It's really one of the things that sets the United States apart from all the other industrialized countries. Is how generous it is, because it is predicated. I mean, it has a post-slavery, right? It's a post-slavery status to emphasize that everyone, regardless of race, that is born in the United States is is a citizen of the United States, but it has also been intended historically to say that we are all part of this community, that what makes you part of the US community is your belonging to the community, not who your parents are. Right? And that it's a very important shift from how nationality has been transferred historically in European countries, for example, and other industrialized countries. Japan. So I have very little concern for that. I don't know. That doesn't mean they're not going to try. But I don't think it's going to be successful. I have two more questions. You and Tatiana.
Thank you for a very insightful discussion. My name is Vaishali Paliwal. I'm a student at MPPM student Public Policy and Management here at UPED. So, we have seen Musk and Ramaswamy come out recently with a very strong support for their H-1B work visas, saying that there's lack of engineering talent and we need more skilled labor. And we are actually seeing this trend across the globe of rising oligarchs and the kind of rising power in the political scene. How do you sort of see these sort of rich and influential leaders maybe in a distorted way, because we know that one of the outcomes is exploitation of the labor, but in this sort of twisted way, might actually do something good for the immigration and might actually minimize the damage we are sort of predicting with these upcoming policies, because they are really very openly, supporting the visas, which we are hearing that's already causing some splits in the incoming president's tent. So what are your sort of views on that?
We're going to talk about because I can tell you, first of all, H-1B visas are problematic for everyone. Right? So that it's one section of the immigration law that there has always been consensus that needs to be dealt with in different ways for different peoples, but it's always been controversial. Those are visas that are only available to highly skilled immigrants, and they have been used traditionally in the STEM areas, and they're the Silicon Valley visas, as they call it. I think that this is a problem that's caused a scheme within the Republican Party. I have enjoyed very much the debate and how Elon Musk caught some of the right-wing organizations' ability to monetize X. That was hilarious. Because that it's autocracy, and that is the consequences of the enormous amount of power that is concentrated in these capitalist moguls in a way that we have never seen it before. So as you say, I think that there might be some contradictions there. I think, however, that whether they would do it's something good, it also remains to be seen. There's a lot of debate regarding H-1B visas anyway. What I think it is important, though, is that it represents makes visible this schism between nationalist political base and the techno-capitalist globalist base, because they're antagonistic. Like they're completely antagonistic. There might be both right wing, but they're completely antagonistic. And I think that it's an interesting development that I look forward to, enjoying with my morning coffee. But I don't know what the ultimate impact it's going to be. I don't venture say who's going to win that.
Can I just add one little thing to that? Is that, again, I agree with what Sheila said. I would emphasize the conflict within the sort of capitalist, they're all capitalists, but like within the sort of between the kind of Wall Street traditional economic and the more sort of tech oriented, like the Ramaswamy, like the kinds of workers that the tech industry cares about ensuring can stay and work without difficulty are really different than the kinds of workers that people in construction or agriculture or food services.
Except avocados.
So the two things are not necessarily irreconcilable, right? You can fix to the liking of somebody like Ramaswamy or Musk, H1B to their liking and still not do other stuff. But I think this point about the contradictions is really important. I think it raises an important political point, which is that those of us who want to try to resist a lot of what's coming need to find intelligent ways and be prepared to intervene in these cleavages and splits in ways that may not be optimal in terms of what our political goals would be, but that can shove things towards less bad. Because frankly, we're going to need a lot of less bad in the next 4 years. I'm not terribly optimistic about an affirmative agenda for the next 4 years, or certainly for the next 2. But mitigating the harm also matters. So like those kinds of cleavages are political opportunities.
And the techno capitalists might not care about the same workers until it comes for them, right? Until they have to clean their own houses and they'll have to cook their own food and clean their own cars and are not able to eat avocados because Mexico is retaliating with tariffs. Which there's a whole avocado diplomacy. There's a whole people actually write about that. It's extremely interesting. But for those of us that are also thinking about political change and how do we move forward politically and political organizing, it's dramatic to see how the Republican Party was able to make a coalition that brought those two sides together. So what does that mean for a future of change and how you strategically and politically deal with that? That is also that's a conversation for another time.
So this is a kind of different question. I'm Tatiana. So what are some of the quote unquote unintended consequences of US immigration policies on countries outside of Latin America, the Caribbean, in regions like Southeast Asia, the MENA region overall, where immigration patterns can also be impacted by global policy shifts?
Oh, me. Well, I mean, you asked about outside of Latin America, and I'll say something about that in a second. But I mean, Shayla earlier raised the sort of important point about people who spent time in prisons in the 80s, who were then repatriated to countries that they never really had a connection with in the first place, causing violence that is now causing. It's useful also to think about how and why those folks ended up in the United States in the 80s in the first place. And the answer is US imperialism and support for right-wing administrations across the region, right? Which has a history going back to the 1860s, when some crazy guy from Texas, whose name I can't remember, briefly declared himself like king of Nicaragua or whatever it was. Like, this is very long. William Browning. So it'll come, yeah, someone can. You all have computers, you can look it up. So there's a long history of this, right? A lot of important anti-colonial thinkers. Ami Césaire is the one who I tend to think of most in this connection, have talked about the boomerang, right? The way in which the practice of fascistic politics abroad, colonialism abroad, imperialism, boomerangs back to affect the home society. Right? So whatever region of the world we're talking about, the United States with its 750 military bases in over 60 countries, spending $1 trillion a year on quote unquote defense, 10 more than the next 10 countries combined, has a lot of boomerangs constantly flying back at it. We have a huge Vietnamese population in this country. Why is that? It's not random. Right? It's a legacy of US foreign policy, right? And we can think about these examples multiplying, right? And then, and it comes back in a funny way to a point that was made earlier about dehumanization. Part of what this sort of ongoing process of US imperialism does is it sort of normalizes dehumanization. And I think Gaza is the best contemporary example of this, right? 1.9 million out of 2.2 million people are displaced from their homes, tens of thousands of children dead, tens of thousands more suffering, horrible health consequences from amputation to malnutrition to whatever it is. Every university in the country destroyed, massive destruction of the education system, right? And the left-wing party in this country, to go back to the earlier question, right, can't even let a medical professional speak for 2 minutes at its national convention about what's going on. That's dehumanization. And our foreign policy is in part designed to produce that, so that when ICE comes knocking on doors of schools or in our communities here in Pittsburgh, our inclination is just to keep our heads down and look the other way. So any kind of politics that protects those who are most at risk of being deported or imprisoned in what's likely to come has to also be an anti-fascist politics, an anti-imperialist politics, a politics in solidarity with Gaza, a politics that is about emancipation for people everywhere.
So I'm gonna close it there because I think that's a great message to close the event, and we're at time. Thank you, Michael. Thank you, Rosa Maria. Thank you, Nathan, for being here. This Border to Border series continues. I know there's more questions. I know you had a question and you had a question. We can continue to have a conversation, but we need also to let the folks go. The Border to Border series continues. Please keep an eye out of that. There are going to be more events at Pitt on these issues. On Monday, there's a panel at the law school at 5 o'clock on how the election affects LGBTQ plus communities, including LGBTQ plus immigrants. So it's going to be on Zoom. So you're welcome to join. And thank you, Kayla and Luz and Liz for hosting us. Thanks you for being here on a Friday.